Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close by Jonathan Safran Foer. Chapter 13. Alive and Alone. We had been searching for 6.5 months when Mr. Black told me that he was finished. And then I was all alone again, and I hadn't accomplished anything, and my boots were the heaviest they'd ever been in my whole life. I couldn't talk to Mom, obviously, and even though toothpaste and the Minch were my best friends, I couldn't talk to them either. Grandpa could talk to animals, but I couldn't, so Buckminster wasn't going to be helpful. I didn't respect Dr. Fine, and it would have taken too long to explain to Stan everything that needed to be explained just to get to the beginning of the story, and I didn't believe in talking to dead people. Farley didn't know if Grandma was home because his shift had just started. He asked if something was wrong, and I told him, I need her. You want I should buzz up? It's okay. As I ran up the 72 stairs, I thought, and anyway, he was an incredibly old guy who slowed me down and didn't know anything useful. I was breathing hard, and I rang her doorbell. I'm glad he said he was finished. I don't know why I invited him to come along with me in the first place. She didn't answer, so I rang again. Why isn't she waiting by the door? I'm the only thing that matters to her. I let myself in. Grandma? Hello? Grandma? I figured maybe she went to the store or something, so I sat on the sofa and waited. Maybe she went to the park for a walk to help her digest, which I know she sometimes did, even though it made me feel weird. Or maybe she was getting some dehydrated ice cream for me, or dropping something off at the post office. But who would she send letters to? Even though I didn't want to, I started inventing. She'd been hit by a cab while she was crossing Broadway, and the cab zoomed away, and everyone looked at her from the sidewalk, but no one helped her because everyone was afraid to do CPR the wrong way. She'd fallen from a ladder at the library and cracked her skull. She was bleeding to death there because there was a section of books that no one ever looked at. She was unconscious at the bottom of the swimming pool at the Y. Kids were swimming 13 feet above her. I tried to think about other things. I tried to invent optimistic inventions, but the pessimistic ones were extremely loud. She'd had a heart attack. Someone had pushed her on the tracks. She'd been raped and murdered. I was looking around her apartment for her. Grandma? What I needed to hear was, I'm okay. But what I heard was nothing. I looked in the dining room and the kitchen. I opened the door to the pantry just in case, but there was only food. I looked in the coat closet in the bathroom. I opened the door on the second bedroom where Dad used to sleep and dream when he was my age. It was my first time being in Grandma's apartment without her. And it felt incredibly weird, like looking at her clothes without her in them, which I did when I went to her bedroom and looked in her closet. I opened the top drawer of the dresser, even though I knew she wouldn't be in there, obviously. So why did I do it? It was filled with envelopes. Hundreds of them. They were tied together in bundles. I opened the next drawer, and it was also filled with envelopes. So was the drawer underneath it. All of them were. I saw from the postmarks that the envelopes were organized chronologically, which means by date, and mailed from Dresden, Germany, which is where she came from. There was one for every day, from May 31st, 1963, to the worst day. Some were addressed to my unborn child, some were addressed to my child. What the? I know I probably shouldn't have, because they didn't belong to me, but I opened one of them. It was sent on February 6, 1972, to my child. It was empty. I opened another from another stack. November 22nd, 1986, to my child. Also empty. June 14th, 1963, to my unborn child. Empty. April 2nd, 1979. Empty. I found the day I was born. Empty. What I needed to know was, where did she put all the letters? I heard a sound from one of the other rooms. I quickly closed the drawer so Grandma wouldn't know I had been snooping around and tiptoed to the front door because I was afraid that maybe what I had heard was a burglar. I heard the sound again, and this time I could tell that it was coming from the guest room. I thought, the renter. I thought, he's real. I'd never loved Grandma more than I loved her right then. I turned around, tiptoed to the guest room, and pressed my ear against it. I didn't hear anything, but when I got down on my knees, I saw the light in the room was on, and I stood up. Grandma, I whispered. Are you in there? Nothing. Grandma? I heard an extremely tiny sound. I got down on my knees again, and this time I saw that the light was off. Is someone in there? I'm 8 years old, and I'm looking for my grandma because I need her desperately. Footsteps came to the door, but I could only barely hear them because they were extremely gentle and because of the carpet. The footsteps stopped. I could hear breathing, but I knew it wasn't Grandma's because it was heavier and slower. Something touched the door. A hand? 2 hands? Hello? The doorknob turned. If you're a burglar, please don't murder me. The door opened. A man stood there without saying anything, and it was obvious he wasn't a burglar. He was incredibly old and had a face like the opposite of Mom's because it seemed like he was frowning even when he wasn't frowning. He was wearing a white short-sleeved shirt so you could see that his elbows were hairy, and he had a gap between his 2 front teeth, like Dad had. Are you the renter? He concentrated for a second, and then he closed the door. Hello? I heard him moving stuff around in the room, and when he came back and opened the door again, he was holding a little book. He opened it to the first page, which was blank. I don't speak, he wrote. I'm sorry. Who are you? He went to the next page and wrote, My name is Thomas. That was my dad's name. It's pretty common. He died. On the next page he wrote, I'm sorry. I told him, Well, you didn't kill my dad. On the next page there was a picture of a doorknob for some reason, so he went to the next page after that and wrote, Well, I'm still sorry. I told him, Thanks. He flipped back a couple of pages and pointed at, I'm sorry. We stood there. He was in the room. I was in the hall. The door was open, but it felt like there was an invisible door between us because I didn't know what to say to him, and he didn't know what to write to me. I told him, I'm Oskar, and I gave him my card. Do you know where my grandma is? He wrote, She went out. Where? He shrugged his shoulders just like Dad used to. Do you know when she'll be back? He shrugged his shoulders. I need her. He was on one kind of carpet, I was on another. The line where they came together reminded me of a place that wasn't in any borough. If you want to come in, he wrote, we could wait for her together. I asked him if he was a stranger. He asked me what I meant. I told him I wouldn't go in with a stranger. He didn't write anything, like he didn't know if he was a stranger or not. Are you older than 70? He showed me his left hand, which said yes, tattooed on it. Do you have a criminal record? He showed me his right hand, which had no tattooed on it. What other languages do you speak? He wrote German, Greek, Latin. Parlez-vous français? He opened and closed his left hand, which I think meant un peu. I went in. There was writing on the walls, writing everywhere, like I wanted so much to have a life, and even just once, even for a second. I hope for his sake that Grandma never saw it. He put down the book and picked up another one, for some reason. For how long have you been living here? I asked. He wrote, How long did your grandmother tell you I've been living here? Well, I said, since Dad died, I guess, so about 2 years? He opened his left hand. Where were you before that? Where did your grandmother tell you I was before that? She didn't. I wasn't here. I thought that was a weird answer, but I was getting used to weird answers. He wrote, Do you want something to eat? I told him, no. I didn't like how much he was looking at me because it made me feel incredibly self-conscious, but there was nothing I could say. Do you want something to drink? What's your story? I asked. What's my story? Yeah, what's your story? He wrote, I don't know what my story is. How can you not know what your story is? He shrugged his shoulders, just like Dad used to. Where were you born? He shrugged his shoulders. How can you not know where you were born? He shrugged his shoulders. Where did you grow up? He shrugged his shoulders. Okay, do you have any brothers or sisters? He shrugged his shoulders. Well, what's your job? And if you're retired, what was your job? He shrugged his shoulders. I tried to think of something I could ask him that he could not shrug his shoulders to the answer of. Are you a human being? He flipped back and pointed at, I'm sorry. I'd never needed Grandma more than I needed her right then. I asked the renter, Can I tell you my story? He opened his left hand, so I put my story into it. I pretended that he was Grandma, and I started at the very beginning. I told him about the tuxedo on the chair, and how I had broken the vase and found the key in the locksmith and the envelope and the art supply store. I told him about the voice of Aaron Black and how I was so incredibly close to kissing Abby Black. She didn't say she didn't want to, just that it wasn't a good idea. I told him about Abe Black and Coney Island and Ada Black and the 2 Picasso paintings and the birds that flew by Mr. Black's window. Their wings were the first thing he had heard in more than 20 years. Then there was Bernie Black, who had a view of Gramercy Park, but not a key to it, which he said was worse than looking at a brick wall. Chelsea Black had a tan line around her ring finger because she got divorced right after she got back from her honeymoon. Don Black was also an animal rights activist, and Eugene Black also had a coin collection. Full Black lived on Canal Street, which used to be a real canal. He didn't speak very good English because he hadn't left Chinatown since he came from Taiwan because there was no real reason for him to. The whole time I talked to him, I imagined water on the other side of the window like we were in an aquarium. He offered me a cup of tea, but I didn't feel like it, but I drank it anyway to be polite. I asked him, did he really love New York, or was he just wearing the shirt? He smiled like he was nervous. I could tell he didn't understand, which made me feel guilty for speaking English for some reason. I pointed at his shirt. Do you really love New York? He said, New York? I said, your shirt. He looked at his shirt. I pointed at the N and said, New. And the Y and said, York. He looked confused or embarrassed or surprised or maybe even mad. I couldn't tell what he was feeling because I couldn't speak the language of his feelings. I not know was New York. In Chinese, Nui mean you. Thought I was I love you. And then I noticed the I love NY poster on the wall, and then I love NY flag on the door, and the I love NY dish towels, and the I love NY lunchbox on the kitchen table. I asked him, well then why do you love everybody so much? Georgia Black, in Staten Island, had turned her living room into a museum of her husband's life. She had pictures of him from when he was a kid and his first pair of shoes and his old report cards, which weren't as good as mine, but anyway. Y'all, the first visitors in more than a year, she said, and she showed us a neat gold medal in a velvet box. He was a naval officer, and I loved being a naval wife. Every few years we'd have to travel to some exotic place. I never did get a chance to put down many roots, but it was thrilling. We spent 2 years in the Philippines. Cool, I said. And Mr. Black started singing a song in some weird language, which I guess was Filipinish. She showed us her wedding album one picture at a time and said, wasn't I slim and beautiful? I told her, you were. Mr. Black said, and you are. She said, aren't you two the sweetest? I said, yeah. This is the 3 wood that he hit a hole in one with. He was real proud of that. For weeks it was all I'd hear about. That's the airplane ticket for my trip to Maui, Hawaii. I'm not too vain to tell you, it was our 13th anniversary. 30 years, we're going to renew our vows, just like a romance novel. His carry-on bag was filled with flowers. Bless his heart. He wanted to surprise me with them on the plane, but I was looking at the x-ray screen, and his bag went through. And don't you know there was a dark black bouquet? It was like the shadows of flowers. What a lucky girl I am. She used a cloth to wipe away our fingerprints. It had taken us 4 hours to get to her house. 2 of those were because Mr. Black had to convince me to get on the Staten Island ferry. In addition to the fact that there was an obvious potential target, there had also been a ferry accident pretty recently. And in stuff that happened to me, I had pictures of people who had lost their arms and legs. Also, I don't like bodies of water, or boats particularly. Mr. Black asked me how I would feel in bed that night if I didn't get on that ferry. I told him, well, heavy boots, probably. And how will you feel if you did? Like $100. So? So what about while I'm on the ferry? What if it sinks? What if someone pushes me off? What if it's hit with a shoulder-fired missile? There won't be a tonight, he said. In which case you won't feel anything anyway. I thought about that. This is an evaluation from his commanding officer, Georgia said, tapping the case. It's exemplary. This is the tie he wore to his mother's funeral, may she rest in peace. She was such a nice woman, nicer than most. And this here is a picture of his childhood home. That was before I knew him, of course. She tapped every case and then wiped away her own fingerprints, kind of like a Mobius strip. These are his varsity letters. This is his cigarette case from when he used to smoke. Here's his Purple Heart. I started to get heavy boots for obvious reasons, like where were all of her things? Where were her shoes and her diploma? Where were the shadows of her flowers? I made a decision that I wouldn't ask about the key because I wanted to believe that we had come to see her museum, and I think Mr. Black had the same idea. I decided to myself that if we went through the whole list and still hadn't found anything, then maybe, if we had no choice, we could come back and ask her some questions. These were his baby shoes. But then I started to wonder, she said these were the first visitors in little more than a year. Dad had died a little more than a year ago. Was he the visitor before us? "Hello, everyone," a man said from the door. He was holding 2 mugs which steam was coming out of, and his hair was wet. "Oh, you're awake," Georgia said, taking the mug that said George on it. She gave him a big kiss, and I was like, what in the what the? "Well, here he is," she said. "Here who is?" Mr. Black asked. "My husband," she said, almost like he was another exhibit in his life. The 4 of us stood there smiling at one another, and then the man said, "Well, I suppose you'd like to see my museum now." I told him. "We just did. It was really great." He said, "No, Oskar, that's her museum. Mine's in the other room." Thank you for your letter. Because of the large volume of mail I receive, I am unable to write personal responses. Nevertheless, know that I read and save every letter with the hope of one day being able to give each the proper response it deserves. Until that day, most sincerely, Stephen Hawking. The week passed quickly. Iris Black, Jeremy Black, Kyle Black, Lori Black. Mark Black was crying when he opened the door and saw us because he had been waiting for someone to come back to him. So every time someone knocked on the door, he couldn't stop himself from hoping it might be that person, even though he knew he shouldn't hope. Nancy Black's roommate told us Nancy was at work at the coffee store on 19th Street, so we went there and I explained to her that coffee actually has more caffeine than espresso, even though a lot of people don't think so because the water is in contact with the grounds for a much longer time with coffee. She told me she didn't know that. "If he says it, it's true," Mr. Black said, patting my head. I told her, "Also, did you know that if you yell for 9 years, you'll produce enough sound energy to heat 1 cup of coffee?" She said, "I didn't." I said, "Which is why they should put a coffee store next to the Cyclone at Coney Island. Get it?" That made me crack up, but only me. She asked if we were going to order anything. I told her, "Iced coffee, please." She asked, "What size?" I said, "Venti. And could you please use coffee ice cubes so it doesn't get all watery when the ice cubes melt?" She told me they didn't have coffee ice cubes. I said, "Exactly." Mr. Black said, "I'm going to get right to the point." And then he did. I went to the bathroom and gave myself a bruise. Ray Black was in prison, so we weren't able to talk to him. I did some research on the internet and found out that he was in prison because he murdered 2 kids after he raped them. There was also pictures of the dead kids, and even though I knew it would only hurt me to look at them, I did. I printed them out and put them in Stuff That Happened to Me right after the picture of Jean-Pierre Hagnel. The French astronaut had been carried from a spacecraft after returning from the Mir space station because gravity isn't only what makes us fall, it's what makes our muscles strong. I wrote a letter to Ray Black in prison, but I never got a response. Inside, I hoped he didn't have anything to do with the key, although I couldn't help inventing that it was for his jail cell. The address for Ruth Black was on the 86th floor of the Empire State Building, which I thought was incredibly weird, and so did Mr. Black, because neither of us knew that people actually lived there. I told Mr. Black that I was panicky, and he said that it was okay to be panicky. I told him I felt like I couldn't do it, and he said it was okay to feel like I couldn't do it. I told him it was the thing that I was most afraid of, and he said that he could understand why. I wanted him to disagree with me, but he wouldn't, so I had no way to argue. I told him I would wait for him in the lobby, and he said, "Fine." Okay, I said. "I'll go." As the elevator takes you up, you hear information about the building, which was pretty fascinating, and normally I would have taken some notes, but I needed all of my concentration for being brave. I squeezed Mr. Black's hand, and I couldn't stop inventing. The elevator cable snapping, the elevator falling and trampling at the bottom, us shooting back up the roof, opening like a cereal box, us flying towards parts of the universe that not even Stephen Hawking was sure about. When the elevator door opened, we got out of the observation deck. We didn't know who to look for, so we just looked around for a while. Even though I knew the view was incredibly beautiful, my brain started misbehaving, and the whole time I was imagining a plane coming at the building just below us. I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop. I imagined the last second when I would see the pilot's face, who would be a terrorist. I imagined us looking at each other in the eyes when the nose of the plane was 1 millimeter from the building. "I hate you," my eyes would tell him. "I hate you," his eyes would tell me. Then there would be an enormous explosion, and the building would sway almost like it was going to fall over, which I knew is what felt like from the descriptions I'd read from the internet, although I wish I hadn't read them. Then there would be smoke coming up at me and people screaming all around me. I read one description of somebody who made it down 85 flights of stairs, which must have been about 2,000 stairs, and he said that people were screaming, "Help!" and "I don't want to die," and one man who owned a company was screaming, "Mommy!" It would be getting so hot that my skin would start to get blisters. It would feel so good to get away from the heat, but on the other hand, when I hit the sidewalk, I would die, obviously. Which would I choose? Would I jump or would I burn? I guess I would jump, because then I wouldn't have to feel pain. On the other hand, maybe I would burn, because then at least I'd have a chance to somehow escape, and even if I couldn't, feeling pain is still better than not feeling, isn't it? I remembered my cell phone. I still had a few seconds. Who should I call? What should I say? I thought about all the things that everyone ever says to each other and how everyone is going to die, whether it's in a millisecond or days or months or 76.5 years, or even if you were just born. Everything that's born has to die, which means our lives are just like skyscrapers. The smoke rises at different speeds, but they're all on fire and we're all trapped. You can see the most beautiful things from the observation deck of the Empire State Building. I read somewhere that people on the street are supposed to look like ants, but that's not true. They look like little people, and the cars look like little cars, and even the buildings look little. It's like New York is a miniature replica of New York, which is nice because you can see what it's really like instead of how it feels when you're in the middle of it. It's extremely lonely up there, and you feel far away from everything. Also, it's scary because there are so many ways to die, but it feels safe too because you're surrounded by so many people. I kept one hand touching the wall as I walked carefully around each of the views. I saw all the locks I'd tried to open and the 161,999,831 that I hadn't yet. I got down on my knees and I crawled one of the binocular machines. I held it tightly as I pulled myself up and I took a quarter from the change dispenser on my belt. When the metal lids opened, I could see things that were far away, incredibly close, like the Woolworth Building, the Union Square, the gigantic hole where the World Trade Center was. I looked into the window of an office building that I guess was about 10 blocks away. It took me a few seconds to figure out the focus, but then I could see a man sitting at his desk writing something. What was he writing? He didn't look at all like Dad, but he reminded me of Dad. I pressed my face closer and my nose got smushed against the cold metal. He was left-handed, like Dad. Did he have a gap between his front teeth like Dad? I wanted to know what he was thinking. Who did he miss? What was he sorry for? My lips touched the metal like a kiss. I found Mr. Black, who was looking at Central Park. I told him I was ready to go down. But what about Ruth? We can come back another day. But we're already here. I don't feel like it. It'll just take a few. I want to go home. He could probably tell that I was about ready to cry. Okay, he said. Let's go home. We got to the end of the line for the elevator. I looked at everyone and wondered where they came from and who they missed and what they were sorry for. There was a fat woman with a fat kid and a Japanese guy and 2 cameras and a girl with crutches whose cast was signed by lots of people. I had a weird feeling that if I examined it, I would find Dad's writing. Maybe he would have written, "Get better soon," or just his name. An old woman was standing a few feet away staring back at me, which made me self-conscious. She was holding a clipboard, although I couldn't see what was on it, and she was dressed old-fashioned. I promised myself I wouldn't be the first to look away, but I was. I pulled on Mr. Black's sleeves and I told him to look at her. "You know what?" he whispered. "What?" "I bet you she's the one." For some reason, I knew he was right, although no part of me wondered if maybe we were looking for different things. "Should we go up to her?" "Probably." "How?" "I don't know." "Go say hello." "You can't just go say hello." "Tell her the time." "But she didn't ask the time." "Ask her the time." "You do it." "You do it." We were so busy arguing about how to go up to her that we didn't even realize that she'd come up to us. "I see that you're thinking about leaving," she said. "But could I interest you in a very special tour of this very special building?" "What's your name?" I asked. She said, "Ruth." Mr. Black said, "We'd love a tour." She smiled, took a huge breath in, and then started walking while she talked. Construction on the Empire State Building began in March of 1930 on the site of the old Waldorf Astoria Hotel at 355th Avenue at 34th Street. It was completed 1 year and 45 days later, 7 million man-hours of work, including Sundays and holidays. Everything about the building was designed to expedite its construction. Prefabricated materials were used as much as possible, And as a result, work progressed at a rate of about 4.5 stories each week. The entire framework took less than half a year to complete. That was less time than how long I had been searching for the lock. She took a breath. Designed by the architectural firm of Shreve, Lamb and Harmon Associates, the original plan called for 86 stories, but a 150-foot mooring pass for zeppelins was added. Today, the mast is used for TV and radio broadcasts. The cost of the building, including the land that it rests on, was $40,948,900. The cost of the building itself was $24,718,000, less than half of the estimated cost of $50 million due to deflated labor and material costs during the Great Depression. I asked, "What was the Great Depression?" Mr. Black said, "I'll tell you later." At 1,250 feet, the Empire State Building was the tallest building in the world until the completion of the first tower of the World Trade Center in 1972. When the building was open, they had such a hard time finding tenants to rent space within that New Yorkers began calling it the Empty State Building. That made me crack up. It was this observatory that saved the building from going into bankruptcy. Mr. Black patted the wall like he was proud of the observatory. The Empire State Building is supported by 60,000 tons of steel. It has approximately 6,500 windows and 10 million bricks, weighing in the neighborhood of 365,000 tons. That's a heavy neighborhood, I said. More than 500,000 square feet of marble in Indiana limestone encase the skyscraper. Inside there's a marble from France, Italy, Germany, and Belgium. In fact, New York's most famous building is made with materials that are just about from everywhere but New York, in much the same way that the city itself was made by great immigrants. Very true, Mr. Black said, nodding his head. The Empire State Building has been the location of dozens of movies, the reception site of foreign dignitaries, and even had a World War II bomber crash into the 79th floor in 1945. I concentrated on happy, safe things like the zipper on the back of Mom's dress and how Dad needed a drink of water whenever he whistled for too long. An elevator fell to the bottom. You'll be relieved to know that the passenger was saved by the emergency brakes. Mr. Black gave my hand a squeeze. And speaking of elevators, there are 70 of them in this building, including the 6th freight elevators. They travel at speeds from 600 to 1,400 feet per minute. Or if you so choose, you can walk the 1,860 steps from the street level to the top. I asked if you could also take the stairs down. On a clear day like this, you can see for 80 miles, well into Connecticut. Since the observatory opened to the public in 1931, almost 110 million visitors have enjoyed the breathtaking vision of the city beneath them. Each year, over 3.5 million people are whisked to the 86th floor to be where Cary Grant waited in vain for Deborah Keir in An Affair to Remember, and where Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan had their fateful meeting in the movie Sleepless in Seattle. Also, the observatory is handicap accessible. She stopped, put her hand on her heart. All in all, the feeling and spirit of New York City is embodied in the Empire State Building. From the people who fell in love here to the ones who have returned with their children and grandchildren, everyone recognizes the building not only as an awe-inspiring landmark which offers one of the most spectacular views on Earth, but an unequaled symbol of American ingenuity. She bowed. We clapped. "Do you young men have another minute?" "We have a lot of minutes," Mr. Black said. "Because that was the end of the official tour, but there are a couple of things I really love about this building, and I only share them with people I suspect will care." I told her, "Will care incredibly much." Well, the dirigible morning mast, now the base of the TV tower, was part of the original construction of the building. One attempt to moor a privately owned blimp was successful, but during another attempt in September 1931, a Navy blimp was almost upended and was nearly swept away, and the celebrities attending this historic affair, while the water ballast drenched pedestrians several blocks away, the mooring mast idea was ultimately abandoned, although it was very romantic. She started walking again, and we followed her, but I wondered if she would have kept talking if we hadn't followed her. I couldn't tell if she was doing what she was doing for us, or for herself, or for some completely other reason. During the spring and autumn bird migration season, the lights that illuminate the tower are turned off foggy nights so that they won't confuse birds, causing them to fly in the building. I told her, 10,000 birds die every year from smashing into windows, because I'd accidentally found that fact out when I was doing some research about the windows in the Twin Towers. That's a lot of birds, Mr. Black said. And a lot of windows, Ruth said. I told them. Yeah, so I invented a device that would detect when a bird is incredibly close to a building, and that would trigger an extremely loud bird call from another skyscraper, and they'd be drawn to that. They'd bounce from one to another. Like pinball? Mr. Black said. What's pinball? I asked. But the birds would never leave Manhattan, Ruth said. Which would be great, I told her, because then your birdseed shirt would be reliable. Would it be all right if I mentioned the 10,000 birds in my future tours? I told her that they didn't belong to me. A natural lightning rod, the Empire State Building, is struck up to 500 times a year. The outdoor observation deck is closed during thunderstorms, but the inside viewing areas remain open. Static electricity buildup is so mammoth on top of the building that under the right conditions, if you stick your hand through the observatory fence, St. Elmo's fire will stream up from your fingertips. St. Elmo's fire is so awesome. Lovers who kiss up here may find their lips crackling with electric sparks. Mr. Black said, That's my favorite part. She said, Mine too. I said, Mine's the St. Elmo's fire. The Empire State Building is located at latitude 40 degrees, 44 minutes, 53.977 seconds north, longitude 73 degrees, 59 minutes, 10.812 seconds west. Thank you. That was delightful, Mr. Black said. Thank you, she said. I asked her how she knew all that stuff, and she said, I know about this building because I love this building. That gave me heavy boots because it reminded me of the lock that I still hadn't found, and how until I found it, I didn't love Dad enough. So what is it about this building? Mr. Black asked. She said, If I had an answer, it really wouldn't be love, would it? You're a terrific lady, he said, and then he asked where her family was from. I was born in Ireland. My family came when I was a young girl. Your parents? My parents are Irish. And your grandparents? Irish. That's marvelous news, Mr. Black said. Why? She asked, which was a question I was also wondering. Because my family has nothing to do with Ireland. We came over on the Mayflower. I said, Cool. Ruth said, I'm not sure I understand. Mr. Black said, We're not related. Why would we be related? Because we have the same last name. Inside I thought, but technically she never actually said her last name was Black, and even if it actually was Black, why wasn't she asking how we knew her last name? Mr. Black took off his beret and got down onto one of his knees, which took him a long time. At the risk of being too forthright, I was hoping I might have the pleasure of your company one afternoon. I will be disappointed, but in no way offended if you decline. She turned her face away. I'm sorry, he said. I shouldn't have. She said, I stay up here. Mr. Black said, What the? I stay up here. Always? Yes. For how long? Oh, a long time. Years. Mr. Black said, Who say? I asked her how. What do you mean, how? Well, where do you sleep? On nice nights, I sleep out here, but when it gets chilly, which is most nights up this high, I have a bed in one of the storage rooms. Well, what do you eat? There are 2 snack bars up here, and sometimes one of the young men will bring me food if I have a taste for something different. As you know, New York offers so many different eating experiences. I asked if they knew she was up here. Who's they? I don't know, the people who own the building or whatever? The building has been owned by a number of different people since I moved here. Well, what about the workers? The workers come and go. The new ones see I'm here and assume I'm supposed to be here. So no one has told you to leave? Never. Why don't you go down? Mr. Black asked. She said, I'm more comfortable here. How could you be more comfortable here? It's hard to explain. How did it start? Well, my husband was a door-to-door salesman, and this was in the old days. He was always selling something or another. He loved the next thing that would change life, and, well, he was always coming up with wonderful, crazy ideas, a bit like you. She said to me, which gave me heavy boots, because why couldn't I remind people of me? One day, he found a spotlight in an army surplus store. This was right after the war, and you could find just about anything. He hooked it up to a car battery and fixed all of that to the crate he rolled around. He told me to go up to the observation deck of the Empire State Building, and as he walked around New York, he'd occasionally shine the light up at me so I could see where he was. It worked? Well, not during the day it didn't. It had to get quite dark before I could see the light, but once I did, it was amazing. It was as if all the lights in New York were turned off except for his. That was how clearly I could see it. I asked her if she was exaggerating. She said, "I'm understanding." Mr. Black said, "Maybe you're telling it exactly as it was." I remember that first night. I came up here and everyone was looking all over, pointing at things to see. There were so many spectacular things to see, but only I had something pointing back at me. "Someone," I said. Yes, something that was someone. I felt like a queen. Isn't that funny? Isn't it silly? I shook my head no. She said, "Well, I just felt like a queen. When the light went off, I knew his day was over, and I'd go down and I'd meet him at home. Well, when he died, I came back up here. It's silly." "No," I said, "it isn't. I wasn't looking for him. I'm not a girl, but it gave me the same feeling that I had when it was daytime and I was looking for his light. I knew it was there, I just couldn't see it." Mr. Black took a step towards her. "Well, I just couldn't bear to go home," she said. I asked why not, even though I was afraid I was going to learn something I didn't want to know. She said, "Because I knew he wouldn't be there." Mr. Black told her, "Thank you," but she wasn't done. "Well, I curled up in a corner that night, that corner over there, and fell asleep. Maybe I wanted the guards to notice me. I don't know. But when I woke up in the middle of the night, I wasn't all alone. It was cold, I was scared, and I walked to the railing. Right there. I never felt more alone. It was as if the building had become much taller or the city had become much darker, but I'd never felt more alive either. I'd never felt more alive or alone." "I wouldn't make you go down," Mr. Black said. "We could spend the afternoon up here." "I'm awkward," she said. "So am I," Mr. Black said. "I'm not very good company. I just told you everything I know." "I'm terrible company," Mr. Black said, although that was not true. "Ask him," he said, pointing at me. "It's true," I said. "He sucks. You can tell me about this building all afternoon. That would be marvelous. That's how I want to spend my time." "Well, I don't even have any lipstick." "Neither do I." She let out a laugh, and then she put her hand over her mouth like she was angry at herself for forgetting her sadness. It was already 2:32 p.m. when I finished walking the 1,860 stairs down to the lobby, and I was exhausted. And Mr. Black seemed exhausted too, so we went straight home. When we got to Mr. Black's door, this was just a few minutes ago, I was already making plans for next weekend because we had to go to Far Rockaway and Boerum Hill and Long Island City, and if we had time, also to Dumbo, but he interrupted me and said, "Listen, Oskar." "That's my name, don't wear it out." "Well, I think I'm finished." "Finished with what?" "I hope you understand." He stuck out his hand for a shake. "Finished with what?" "Well, I loved being with you. I've loved every second of it. You got me back into the world. That's the greatest thing anyone could have done for me, but now I think I'm finished. I hope you understand." His hand was still open, waiting for my hand. I told him, "I don't understand." I kicked his door and told him, "You're breaking your promise." I pushed him and shouted, "It isn't fair." I got on my tiptoes and put my mouth next to his ear and shouted, "Fuck you!" No, I shook his hand. And then I came straight here, and now I don't know what to do. As I'd been telling the renter the story, he kept nodding his head and looking at my face. He stared at me so hard that I wondered if he wasn't listening to me at all, or if he was trying to hear something incredibly quiet underneath what I was saying, sort of like a metal detector, but for truth instead of metal. I told him, "Well, I've been searching for more than 6 months, and I don't know a single thing that I didn't know 6 months ago. And actually, I have negative knowledge because I skipped all those French classes with Marcel. Also, I've had to tell a googolplex of lies, which doesn't make me feel good about myself, and I've bothered a lot of people who've probably ruined my chances of ever being real friends with. And I miss my dad more now than when I started, even though the whole point was to stop missing him." I told him, "It's starting to hurt too much." He wrote, "What is?" Then I did something that surprised even me. I said, "Hold on." And I ran down the 72 stairs across the street right past Dan, even though he was saying, "You've got mail," and up the 105 stairs. The apartment was empty. I wanted to hear beautiful music. I wanted Dad's whistling and the scratching sound of his red pen and the pendulum swinging in his closet and him tying his shoelaces. I went to my room and got the phone. I ran back down the 105 stairs, past Dan, who was still saying, "You've got mail," back up the 72 stairs and into Grandma's apartment. I went to the guest room. The renter was standing in exactly the same position, like I'd never left, or never been there at all. I took the phone out of the scarf that Grandma was never able to finish, plugged it in, and played those first 5 messages for them. He didn't show anything on his face. He just looked at me. Not even at me, but into me, like his detector sensed some enormous truth deep inside me. "No one's ever heard that," I said. "What about your mother?" he wrote. "Especially not her." He crossed his arms and held his hands in his armpits, which for him was like putting his hands over his mouth. And I said, "Not even Grandma." And his hands started shaking, like birds trapped under a tablecloth. Finally, he let go. He wrote, "Maybe he saw what happened and ran in to save somebody." He would have. That's what he was like. He was a good person. He was the best person, but he was in the building for a meeting, and also, he said he went up to the roof, so he must have been above where the plane hit, which means he didn't run in to save anyone. Well, maybe he just said he was going to the roof. Why would he do that? What kind of meeting was it? He runs the family jewelry business. He has meetings all the time. The family jewelry business? My grandpa started it. Who's your grandpa? I don't know. He left my grandma before I was born. She says he could talk to animals and make a sculpture that was more real than the real thing. What do you think? I don't think anyone can talk to animals except to dolphins, maybe, or sign language to chimps. Well, what do you think about your grandpa? I don't think about him. He pressed play and listened to the messages again, and again I pressed stop after the 5th was finished. He wrote, "He sounds calm in the last message," I told him. I read something in the National Geographic about how when an animal thinks it's going to die, it gets panicky and starts to act crazy, but when it knows it's going to die, it gets very, very calm. Maybe he didn't want you to worry. Maybe. Maybe he didn't say he loved me because he loved me, but that wasn't a good enough explanation. I said, "I need to know how he died." He flipped back and pointed at why. "So I can stop inventing how he died. I'm always inventing." He flipped back and pointed at, "I'm sorry." I found a bunch of videos on the internet of bodies falling. They were on a Portuguese site where there are all sorts of stuff that they weren't showing here, even though it happened here. Whenever I try to learn about how Dad died, I have to go to a translator program and find out how to say things in different languages, like September, or people jumping from burning buildings, which is Menschen die aus brechenden Gusten springen. And I Google those words. It makes me incredibly angry that people all over the world can know things that I can't because it happened here and happened to me. So shouldn't it be mine? I printed out the frames from the Portuguese videos and examined them extremely closely. There's one body that could be him. It's dressed like he was, and when I magnify it until the pixels are so big that it stops looking like a person, sometimes I can see glasses. Or I think I can, but I know I probably can. It's just me wanting it to be him. You want him to have jumped? I just want to stop inventing. If I could know how he died, exactly how he died, I wouldn't have to invent him dying inside an elevator that was stuck between floors, which happened to some people, and I wouldn't have to imagine him trying to crawl down the outside of the building, which I saw a video of one person doing on a Polish site, or trying to use a tablecloth as a parachute like some of the people who were in the Windows of the World actually did. There's so many different ways to die, and I just need to know which was his. He held out his hands like he wanted me to take them. Are those tattoos? He closed his right hand. I flipped back and pointed at why. He took back his hands and wrote, "It's made things easier. Instead of writing yes and no all the time, I can show my hands." But why just yes and no? I only have 2 hands. What about I'll think about it, and probably, and it's possible? He closed his eyes and concentrated a few seconds. Then he shrugged his shoulders, just like Dad used to. Have you always been silent? He opened his right hand. Then why don't you talk? He wrote, I can't. Why not? He pointed at, I can't. Are your vocal cords broken or something? Something is broken. Well, when was the last time you talked? A long, long time ago. What was the last word that you said? He flipped back and pointed at I. I was the last word that you said? He opened his left hand. Does that even count as a word? He shrugged his shoulders. Do you try to talk? I know what will happen. What? He flipped back and pointed at, I can't. Try. Now? Try to say something. He shrugged his shoulders, and I said, please. He opened his mouth and put his fingers on his throat. They fluttered like Mr. Black's fingers looking for a one-word biography, but no sound came out, not even an ugly sound or a breath. I asked him, what were you trying to say? He flipped back and pointed at, I'm sorry. I said, it's okay. I said, maybe your vocal cords actually are broken. You should go to a specialist. I asked him, well, what were you trying to say? He pointed at, I'm sorry. I asked, can I take a picture of your hands? He put his hands on his lap, face up like a book. Yes and no. I focused Grandpa's camera. He kept his hands extremely still. I took the picture. I told him, I'm going to go home now. He picked up his book and wrote, what about your grandma? Tell her I'll talk to her tomorrow. As I was halfway across the street, I heard clapping behind me, almost like the bird's wings outside Mr. Black's window. I turned around and the renter was standing at the building's door. He put his hand on his throat and opened his mouth like he was trying to speak again. I called back to him, what are you trying to say? He wrote something in his book and held it up, but I couldn't see it, so I ran back over. It said, please don't tell your grandmother that we met. I told him, I won't if you won't. And I didn't even wonder the obvious thing, which was why he would want to keep it a secret. He wrote, if you ever need me for anything, just throw Pebbles at the guest room window. I'll come down and meet you under the street lamp. I said, thanks, although inside I was thinking, why would I ever need you? All I wanted was to fall asleep that night, but all I could do was invent. What about frozen planes, which could be safe from heat-seeking missiles? What about subway turnstiles that were also radiation detectors? What about incredibly long ambulances that connected every building to a hospital? What about parachutes and fanny packs? What about guns with sensors in the handles that could detect if you were angry, and if you were, they wouldn't fire, even if you were a police officer? What about Kevlar overalls? What about skyscrapers made with moving parts so that they could rearrange themselves when they had to, and even open holes in their middles for planes to fly through? What about... And then a thought came into my brain that wasn't like the other thoughts. It was closer to me and louder. I didn't know where it came from or what it meant, or if I loved or I hated it. It opened up like a fist or a flower. What about digging up Dad's empty coffin?